amount, like maybe 112 billion barrels will be found there. So what we'll do is we'll split the difference and assume that 47 billion barrels will be found in East Greenland. Okay, I'm not an expert in statistics. It sounds okay to me. But if you apply this statistical method consistently across the globe, what you come up with is the expectation that global oil discovery, which peaked in 1960 and has been going downhill ever since, is miraculously going to turn around and begin going back up again. But real-life experience is not supporting that assumption. And it's this assumption on which we are basing our national energy policy. Here's John Thompson of ExxonMobil Exploration Company. He's saying, we estimate that world oil and gas production from existing fields is declining at an average rate of 4 to 6% a year. To meet projected demand in 2015, the industry will have to add about 100 million oil equivalent barrels a day of new production. That's equal to about 80% of today's production level. In other words, by 2015, we'll need to find, develop, and produce a volume of new oil and gas equal to 8 out of every 10 barrels being produced today. Now, what he is saying in words is essentially what the IEA is showing in this chart. Okay, so everybody has pretty much agreed that that is the situation. Now the question is that possible? Is that going to happen? Those of us who are predicting a near-term oil production peak are saying no. Chris Grabowski of Petroleum Review in London published in April of this year a very important report called Oil Field Mega Projects, in which he looks forward to, it takes 5 to 7 years to bring a new oil discovery into production. Sometimes even longer, but that's a good benchmark. Maybe 3 years if it's in really an accessible area. So we should look forward and see, well, how many discoveries are there on the conveyor belt that are being developed now to provide all of this new oil production that we're going to need in the next 5, 10, 15 years. So Grabowski looked forward and he found, in fact, there are some important new offshore projects off of West Africa, off the coast of Brazil, in the Gulf of Mexico, few others. They are, in fact, going to provide 5 to 7 million barrels a day of new production. Great. But remember what we need here. Okay? We need 5 to 7 million barrels of new production every year going forward. So Grabowski is predicting a global oil production peak probably for 2006. Yes, this is where we are. Okay, where is the remaining oil? No secrets there. Europe, Asia Pacific, North America, former Soviet Union, Africa, South and Central America, and the Middle East. Now, we have to take into account that, in fact, this bar should be considerably shorter because many of the reported reserves that make up this nice tall bar are self-reported reserves of OPEC nations. You know, there's no global oil cop that goes around with a big dipstick to confirm that, in fact, Saudi Arabia has 256 billion barrels, just like they publish in BP Annual Review. The IEA doesn't do that. USGS doesn't do it. So it's all self-reporting. So this bar should probably be at least a third shorter than it is. But even given that, that's still a heck of a lot of oil, right, from a geopolitical point of view. And where is it geographically? It's in this nice little horseshoe-shaped region encompassing southern and western Iraq, eastern Saudi Arabia, Oman, few United Arab Emirates, a couple of other countries in there, Kuwait, and so on. So much of the Middle East actually doesn't have that much oil in it. It's just this rather small area. And that's what we're all fighting over. So these folks have a plan for dealing with our global energy famine that is coming fast upon us. Oil, natural gas, natural gas primarily in this country at first. It's not going to hit the rest of the world for another decade probably. And that strategy is what I call in PowerDown, last one standing. It's essentially using the military prowess of the U.S. to commandeer the world's remaining oil resources and use them till they're gone. Smart. Why do I think that these folks would have this in mind? Well, Dick Cheney, when he was still chairman of the world's largest oil service company, Halliburton, in 1999 gave a speech at the International Petroleum Institute in London in which he said, and this is all very familiar, we've already seen it in the IEA and John Thompson of ExxonMobil, he's saying essentially the same thing. By some estimates, there will be an average of 2% annual growth in global oil demand over the years ahead, along with, conservatively, a 3% natural decline in production from existing reserves. That means by 2010, we will need on the order of an additional 50 million barrels a day of new production. And that jives very closely with, again, with the IEA and John Thompson. And to see that in perspective, that's about 6 times Saudi Arabia's current output. Okay, so in 1999, Dick Cheney had every reason to understand the basic outline of the situation that we are in right now. He had every reason to assume that by the middle of the first decade of the 20th century, we would be experiencing an oil shock. Oil prices would be skyrocketing. And so what does he do? The very first thing he gets in office, he convenes a secret energy task force. And all that we know about the deliberations of this task force consist of a few documents that were released as a result of a lawsuit brought by Judicial Watch, a conservative watchdog organization. And these documents consist entirely of maps of the oil-producing fields of Iraq and neighboring countries. This is our energy plan going forward. Back to the IEA. This is another IEA internal slide. Global energy security threats, U.S. refinery bottlenecks, political unrest in Venezuela. Oh yes, unrest, right. That's a euphemism for something else, I think. Fuel price protests in Europe, strikes in Norway, Saudi terrorism, civil unrest in Nigeria, sabotage in Iraq, reform in Russia, political unrest in Indonesia, nuclear accidents in Japan. Oh my goodness, the headaches we have. Hurricanes from global climate change. They didn't even get around to mentioning that. So, what are we facing here? We are facing, I think, as Dick Cheney told us, war for the remainder of our lifetimes. I think he was being quite candid when he made that comment. And those are going to take several different forms. We're going to see wars between rich consuming nations and poorer producing nations, like U.S. and Iraq, maybe, or how about Venezuela, or any other country that is seeking to take charge of its own resources. But that's not the only kind of conflict that we're likely to see. Also between consuming nations. Now these may not be shooting wars, at least not right off the bat, but what happens when competition between the U.S. and China really heats up for the world's remaining oil reserves? As long as we are this side of the peak, there is enough to go around. There is enough to meet demand. Even as China's demand is soaring, we're not at the peak yet. That demand can still be met. China is looking for long-term oil contracts in places like Central Asia, Saudi Arabia. Now the Saudis, interestingly enough, have given almost all of their recent long-term oil contracts to China rather than the U.S. And this has, as you can imagine,